My name is Simon and this is How to Build a Racing Car. This is a race report from the 6th round of the 2017 New South Wales Formula V State Championship held at Wakefield Park Raceway. I've been pretty lucky this year as far as mechanical issues go. Apart from the club round at the start of the year and a few little issues during practice sessions, the car has been pretty much bulletproof. Well, that had to run out sometime, and though I didn't know it at the outset, this was going to be a very difficult weekend. The first couple of practice sessions went okay. They put us out with the Formula Fords and even a couple of Formula 4s, which was interesting. The speed differential is massive and resulted in a few close calls, but apart from that, these were pretty uneventful. I didn't seem to be getting faster as the day went on. Instead, I was getting more and more inconsistent. I was missing braking zones, messing up my gear shifts, getting my lines wrong in corners. I was losing my consistency but couldn't seem to fix it. Eventually, this culminated in me locking up the front tyres and firing myself into the gravel. The car was sitting on its belly, and when I tried to get out, the rear tyres dug themselves a little hole to spin in. This gave me some time to stop and think about what was going wrong, and I realised that pretty much all of my issues could be caused by the throttle not returning fully to its stop. When we got the car back to the pits, we checked this and found it to be the case. The spring is just a little bit too long to reliably return it fully to zero, which hadn't been a problem before, but I think the friction in the throttle cable must have increased over time, finally reaching a point where it just couldn't be returned to zero. For now, one of my fellow competitors had another spring which we used to ensure that the throttle would be returned reliably to zero, but I'd need to replace that throttle cable before the next round. We got that done on Saturday morning before qualifying. I wasn't in the best position here because I hadn't been able to get myself or the car dialed in during practice. I'd been driving around a problem with the car. I'd have to try and find some speed in qualifying. When I headed out, I found myself way down on power, most likely a fouled plug which would put me a cylinder down. I opted to stay out and try and clear it, which did work after a couple of laps. Darren had exactly the same issue as I did, but mine cleared itself before his, so I went to pass him. I hit the brakes towards turn 2 and found that there was still some sort of issue with the rear brakes. There were two cars in front, and with Darren on my left, I was boxed in and unable to slow down as fast as them. I was able to slip through a little gap between the cars, avoiding an accident and shooting off the track. That was it then. I wouldn't have time to come in, find the issue with the rear and go back out again. I decided to stay out and get the best lap in that I could. Somehow I wasn't last despite the issue. I was 14th out of 16, 3 seconds from pole. Normally I'd have time before race 1 to take a look at the problem, but this weekend they were kind enough to give us 4 races rather than the normal 3. We had about 30 minutes between qualifying and race 1, which is about enough time to come in and put fuel in the car, not enough to fix whatever the issue was. I went out to take part in the race in order to get the points, but literally left the car in 4th and drove around behind the field. The one positive is that for once I got to watch a Formula V race. Finally we got to take a look at this brake issue. What we found was that brake fluid was being forced out of the rear master cylinder reservoir. The rear brake master cylinder also moved right to the end of its stroke when the pedal was pressed, and behind the wheel I wasn't able to pump the brakes up to get them back. We decided there must be something wrong with the master cylinder. Perhaps some sort of debris came through the system from the reservoir and dislodged the seal, allowing fluid to go back into the reservoir rather than the calipers. We used an air compressor to flush the system, then bled it once again. The pedal felt good and gave me some confidence going into race 2. The checkmate had issues in race 1, which meant it was starting beside me at the back. This is a good opportunity to take a look at it. It's another one-off car just like mine, but unlike mine, the owner has focused heavily on the detail. Being beside this car and getting a close look, you can tell that this thing is perfect. Every joint, every detail, every part has clearly had countless hours spent on it, and it really shows in its achievements. It's won pretty much every event that it's entered. The owner was one of the first people I talked to before I started my car. He was really helpful and gave me some good advice on the design. It's not often that it takes part in state events, so I thought I'd give it the credit that it deserves. It's a really special car. Back to my less than perfect car. One issue I had, even with the freshly bled brakes, was that I'd been winding the bias further and further rear earlier when I had the issue, thinking I'd be able to wind some balance into it. I used the outlap to try and correct the bias. Basically, I would accelerate and brake hard enough to lock up, find which end of the car was locking up first, and wind the bias the opposite way. I managed to get it close to balance, but couldn't be sure it was where I wanted it without having driven at race pace. The race got underway. I got away okay, but was tentative into turn 2. I wasn't sure whether William would leave me room on the outside of the corner if I went that way. Heading up the hill, the checkmate headed past, then heading up, Lachlan made a move on the inside of me over the top. He came and apologised to me for this later, which was nice, but I don't really see anything wrong with the move. The back just stepped out slightly while we were side by side. He was also having issues with his rear brakes this weekend, which he said contributed. I I got by William but locked up into the fishhook with my now working rears. I'd not got the balance quite right. I wound the brakes forwards to try and rectify it and got back by, but that was about as much progress as I'd make that race. The safety car was sent out when Darren had a wheel let go coming out of the last corner. I'd hoped that the safety car would allow me to catch the pack again, but quickly it became apparent that they wouldn't be able to remove the car in time, and so the race would finish under the safety car. The rear brakes felt great as that race started, but I did feel them start to slowly deteriorate as it progressed. After the second race, we found that the rear left wheel had a lot of play. The main axle nut was tight, so we started disassembling the main bearing retainer. There wasn't anything obviously wrong with it, but there was a lot of axial play, probably between 2 or 3 millimeters. I spoke to some of the more experienced guys in the field, and they told me that it wouldn't be likely to fail, but fixing it here would be quite difficult. We decided to just rebuild it on Sunday morning with a new seal kit. Somehow the new O-rings seemed to get rid of a lot of the play. This, not the master cylinder, is most likely where the rear brake issues came from this weekend, by the way. The massive amount of movement must have forced the fluid back through the system. The fact that the brakes were rock solid for the rest of the weekend would seem to support this. The other thing I wanted to do on Sunday morning before race 3 was remove a whole bunch of lead. The scales were reading heavy this weekend, everyone was coming in way overweight, and when I checked myself I found that I was about 544 kilos, almost 30 kilograms over the 515 kilo limit. I pulled out close to 20 kilos. I'd weighed the car with fuel, so I didn't want to take all of my ballast out. Race 3 I left the line side by side with Simon Duffy, but managed to get ahead around the outside of turn 2. I wasn't able to keep up with Jeff, so was having a fairly lonely race until Darren came up behind me. He spent a lap larger my mirrors and got by into the last corner. Like with Jeff, Darren was slowly able to pull away from me. Having had such a difficult weekend meant I was really on the back foot with my car setup and practice. I'd have finished 9th if it weren't for Darren having a big lock up into the fishhook, which sent him sailing off into the dirt. Bad for him, good for me. The race ended with me in 8th position. Race 4, much like race 3, had me getting off the line side by side with the person starting 7th, Jeff this time rather than Simon. We headed through turn 1, passing a slow Steve with Jeff on the inside for turn 2. I held my line and passed him around the outside. Steve got back by a lap or so later through turn 2. I probably should have been a bit more defensive here. I wasn't going to keep up with those ahead, so I wouldn't benefit from letting him through so easily. I wouldn't be able to keep up with him, and now I had Jeff and Darren in my mirrors. I tried to hold position around the outside of the last corner with Jeff, but just had no chance. I was, however, able to stay ahead of Darren. Jeff gave me a lovely tow down the straight, which prevented Darren from getting through, plus it gave me a good look into turn 2, which I took advantage of. Next lap though, I ran a little bit wide through the last corner and ruined my run onto the main straight, giving them both an easy way through. From here we held a station for a while, Darren and Jeff in front and I had Aaron behind me. As we went around the second corner coming towards the end of the race, I accelerated out and found Jeff slowing in front of me. I took evasive action. He had, in his words, a gearbox full of shrapnel, and so his race ended there. I gave him a wave the next time around as he watched the last lap from the flag post. That was where the race ended, with me in 8th place. So as I mentioned, an extremely difficult weekend with a number of mechanical issues. There is a positive though. Despite the problems, I still haven't had any DNFs in the State Series. I'm now one of only 2 drivers on the grid with the championship leader Craig Spark to have had no DNFs. I'd also like to say, and I've said this before, the people in Formula V really deserve credit for how much assistance they provide. I really relied on the help of my fellow competitors and their supporters this round. It was fantastic. So where am I in the championship? Well, I mentioned earlier we had 4 races this weekend. During this event it was unclear whether all 3 or 4 would count towards the state championship due to a rules issue which required clarification. If only 3 counted, then the first race would not be included. As luck would have it, this race wouldn't be included, and this was the one that I had the brake issue in. I won't have this low score affect my championship. As far as where I stand, John was unfortunately unable to make it this round, and so I moved ahead of him with a substantial gap. With only 1 round to go, 5th is looking increasingly likely for me in the state championship. Anyway, one last thing I'd like to mention before I finish up. This channel recently had a big jump in views and comments, which is great. I do try and get back to people that ask questions as much as possible, but I thought it might be appropriate to do like a Q&A style video, since there are a lot of similar questions that come through and it would be good to have a single place to answer them. I'll gather all of the questions that come through and try to answer them there, so feel free to leave your own either on this video or on Facebook or Twitter. That's it for this round. I'll see you on the next one.